Picture a lamp that lights up every room in the house except the one it stands in. It burns for the hallway, for the kitchen, for the guest room where someone else is sleeping, and it never once turns its light on itself. For years, that is what many of us have been doing with our own attention. We illuminate everyone else's mood, everyone else's needs, everyone else's version of who we should be, and we leave our own room in the dark, telling ourselves this is simply what a good person does. It is not until much later, often after real exhaustion, that we ask a quiet, uncomfortable question. When did I last turn this light on myself? Nobody teaches this directly. No one sits you down and says, from now on, watch others before you watch yourself. It happens in smaller ways, in the small currency of approval that children learn to trade in early. A certain tone of voice meant safety. A certain mood in the house meant you should shrink a little. Being easy to manage often earned more warmth than being honest, so a habit formed quietly. Read the room first. Decide who you're allowed to be second. That habit does not stay in childhood. It grows up with you, wearing adult clothes, showing up in meetings, in friendships, in marriages, in the private negotiations you have with yourself before you ever speak a sentence out loud. Focusing on yourself does not mean becoming someone who no longer notices other people's pain. That would not be strength. It would simply be a different kind of damage. What it actually means is much narrower and much harder. Refusing to let your own worth be decided by people who were never asked to hold that responsibility in the first place. It means your calm no longer depends on someone's approval of a decision you have already made in good conscience. It means the story of your life finally gets told with you as its subject, instead of as a quiet supporting character standing just outside every scene. Consider how much of an ordinary day disappears into calculations that have nothing to do with your own direction. A message gets reread twice, not to improve it, but to guess how it might be received. A silence in a conversation gets replayed for hours, searching for a slight that may never have existed. An opinion never spoken aloud gets imagined anyway, and somehow still manages to change your mood. This is not empathy. Empathy moves toward another person with understanding. What we are describing moves toward fear, dressed up so convincingly as consideration that most people never question it. Fear is usually the real machinery underneath all this outward watching. Fear of being called selfish for wanting something simply because you want it. Fear of disappointing someone whose disappointment was never actually your responsibility to prevent. Fear of losing warmth you were never sure you had earned honestly in the first place. So the attention keeps leaking outward, in small amounts, almost too small to notice, until one day you look for it and realize there is very little left for the one person who has been quietly waiting for it the longest: yourself. Work often becomes another stage for this same pattern, only dressed in the language of ambition. A promotion gets chased, not because it fits the life you actually want, but because turning it down might look like a lack of hunger to people whose opinion of your hunger was never yours to manage. A project gets carried long after it stopped teaching you anything, simply because walking away might be read as weakness by an audience that will have forgotten the whole situation within a month. Focusing on yourself here means asking a much quieter, much more honest question than what will this look like on paper? Does this actually serve the life I am trying to build, or only the image I am afraid to lose? Guilt is often the gatekeeper standing between a person and this kind of change. Not guilt in its useful form, the kind that follows genuine wrongdoing and points you toward repair, but a manufactured guilt that appears the moment you choose yourself over someone else's comfort. This manufactured guilt does not pause to ask whether the choice was fair. It only registers whether any friction occurred at all and treats that friction as proof of wrongdoing, regardless of whether any wrong was actually done. Learning to tell these two kinds of guilt apart, the kind that teaches you something true, and the kind that simply keeps you compliant, is one of the quiet turning points in this entire process. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with hours slept. It is the tiredness of being known by everyone except yourself. You can name a friend's triggers without hesitation, sense a partner's mood before they speak, remember a colleague's preferences down to the smallest detail, and still stumble when someone asks what genuinely makes you feel alive. That question should not be difficult. Yet for people who have spent years reading everyone else, it can feel like being asked directions to a place they have never actually visited. Friendship carries its own version of this exhaustion, one that hides especially well because it wears the language of loyalty. Being the friend who is always available, always listening, always absorbing whatever needs to be set down, can look like devotion from the outside. From the inside, it can feel like being a waiting room that no one ever checks in on. Focusing on yourself here does not mean withdrawing your care. It means noticing when a friendship has quietly become a current running in only one direction, and allowing yourself to ask for the same depth of attention you have spent years offering so freely without keeping score. To focus on yourself in any way that actually changes something is to become curious again, almost like meeting a stranger you have lived beside your whole life without properly introducing yourself. Curious about what draws your attention without needing anyone's permission first. Curious about what quietly drains you and how long you have been ignoring that drain out of habit. It means letting the question, "What do I want?" come before the question, "What will this cost me in other people's opinions?" That single reordering, wanting first, worrying second, does not sound dramatic, but it rebuilds the architecture of an entire life from the inside. People sometimes mistake this shift for arrogance, but arrogance needs an audience. It needs comparison to feel satisfied. What we are describing needs neither. It is quieter than performance and far less interested in being noticed. It shows up in small, almost invisible decisions, choosing rest without narrating a justification for it, choosing silence instead of over-explaining a choice that was never anyone else's to approve. Choice that was never anyone else's to approve, choosing your own timeline over a schedule. Someone else assumed you would follow without complaint. One of the clearest signs that a life has been built around other people's comfort is how depleted certain rooms can leave you, even rooms filled with people you genuinely love. That depletion is rarely only about them. Often it is about how much of yourself had to be folded away just to keep the atmosphere pleasant. Real self-focus begins asking a plain, uncomfortable question in those moments. Is this relationship, this habit, this constant reading of everyone's temperature actually giving anything back? Or has it simply been withdrawing from the same account for years without ever making a deposit? There is grief hidden inside this process too, one rarely spoken about honestly. As your attention turns inward, some people around you will resist the change. Not because you have done anything wrong, but because your new boundaries disturb a comfort they had grown quietly used to. This does not mean the shift was a mistake. It often means it was overdue. growth rarely announces itself gracefully. It usually arrives first as disruption, and only afterward, once the dust settles, does it reveal itself as clarity. This inward focus also asks something harder than most people expect: the ability to sit inside someone else's disappointment without rushing to repair it immediately. For years, keeping everyone comfortable may have felt like a personal duty. But peace that depends on managing every reaction around you is not peace at all. It is a performance with no intermission. Real steadiness begins the moment you can let someone feel disappointed by a decision that protected your own well-being, and still remain upright without collapsing into apology or guilt. This is not coldness. It is the quiet composure of someone who no longer needs a permission slip to live inside their own life. This pattern rarely stays confined to close relationships either. It spreads into how we experience the wider world, especially now, when so much of daily existence unfolds in front of an audience we cannot even see clearly. A glance at how other people appear to be living becomes an invisible ruler for measuring our own pace. Someone else's visible progress starts to feel like a silent verdict on our own worth, even though we are comparing our unfiltered effort to a version of their life edited for display. This is one of the more exhausting ways of losing yourself, holding your private struggle up against someone else's curated highlight, and somehow always finding your own life lacking by comparison. Family and tradition often deepen this pattern further. Many of us grew up in homes where love was expressed through expectation, where being a good son, a good daughter, a good sibling meant folding your preferences neatly into the family's existing picture of who you were supposed to become. Questioning that picture can feel at first like disloyalty, even when all you are actually doing is trying to live a life that is honestly your own. Focusing on yourself here does not mean discarding the people who raised you or the values worth keeping. It means learning to separate the values that genuinely serve your growth from the expectations that were only ever protecting someone else's comfort. There is also a quiet cost to constant outward watching that rarely gets named directly: decision fatigue, when every choice, however small, passes first through an invisible panel of imagined reactions. Even simple decisions begin to feel heavy. What to wear, what to say in a difficult moment, whether to accept an opportunity, whether to finally end something that has stopped serving you, all of it gets weighed against approval that was never guaranteed in the first place. Turning inward lightens this load in a way that is hard to describe until it is felt directly. When the first question becomes, what do I actually think, rather than what will they think, decisions begin moving with far less residue of doubt trailing behind them. This inward turn also reshapes how criticism lands. When your sense of self depends on your own understanding rather than a constant stream of outside validation, disagreement stops feeling like an emergency. Someone can dislike a choice you made, misunderstand your intention entirely, even say something sharp about who you are, and none of it threatens the ground beneath your feet the way it once did. You can hear a hard opinion, weigh it honestly, and release it if it does not serve your growth, instead of carrying it for weeks like proof against yourself. There is a paradox worth sitting with here. The very thing that looks, from a distance, like turning away from other people, often ends up making you far more capable of actually being present with them. A person constantly managing their own anxiety about being liked has very little real attention left over to offer anyone else, no matter how much time they spend in the room. Once that anxious management quiets down, attention becomes available again, not performed, not divided, simply given, because it is no longer being spent watching yourself be watched. None of this produces someone unreachable or emotionally unavailable. Strangely, the opposite tends to happen. People who focus inward in a healthy way often become more present with others, not less, because they are no longer distracted by constant self-monitoring in the background. When you are not busy managing how you appear, you can actually listen. When you are not busy earning approval, kindness stops being a survival strategy and becomes something closer to an honest choice. Offered without the quiet resentment that builds when giving is really just another form of fear. There is a deeper honesty waiting inside this shift too, one that reaches back into your own history. You start noticing how many decisions, in relationships, in career, in the smallest daily habits, were made to protect an image rather than express a truth. Instead of judging yourself harshly for this, you can simply acknowledge it plainly. I did what I knew how to do at the time, and now I know something different. That is not self-blame. It is self-recognition, and it tends to be the beginning of change that actually holds, because it grows from understanding rather than punishment. It also changes the tone of the voice inside your own head. For years, that voice may have sounded like a committee of everyone you were trying not to disappoint, narrating your every move before you had even finished making it. As self-focus deepens, that voice slowly starts to sound like your own again. Steadier, less rushed, less interested in bracing for a reaction that has not even happened yet. As this inward focus continues, solitude starts to feel different too. Time alone stops registering as absence and starts registering as repair. You are not alone because no one wants your attention. You are alone because, for the first time in a long while, you have some attention left over for yourself, and you are learning what to do with it. This is usually where real clarity grows, not in the noise of other people's expectations, but in the quieter room where you can finally hear your own thinking without static. It becomes easier over time, too, to notice which relationships were built on mutual respect, and which were only ever built on your willingness to disappear a little in order to keep things smooth. This is not about severing people harshly. It is about being honest with yourself regarding what a relationship actually costs, and whether that cost is sustainable across years, not just across a single comfortable evening. Some relationships grow stronger once the overgiving stops, because the other person respects the new boundary and meets you inside it. Others were only ever at ease with the version of you that asked for nothing. Watching which is which tells you almost everything worth knowing. It helps, too, to consider this shift across the span of an entire life rather than a single difficult week. 10 years from now, most of the opinions you are currently protecting so carefully will likely be forgotten, even by the people who once held them. What will remain is the shape of the life you built while protecting those opinions, or the shape of the life you built once you finally stopped. Seen from that distance, most of the approval chased so anxiously turns out to be temporary, while the cost of chasing it, in time, in honesty, in self-trust, tends to linger far longer than the approval itself ever did. Perhaps the most important part of this shift is understanding that focusing on yourself is not a destination you arrive at once and then leave behind. It is a practice, something returned to again and again, especially on days when old patterns try to pull your attention back outward. There will be moments you slip, checking, apologizing, shrinking without noticing you have done it. That is not failure. It is simply proof that old patterns run deep and that returning to yourself is a skill sharpened continually, never a switch flipped once and forgotten. In the end, choosing to focus on yourself is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of responsibility toward the one person who will remain with you for the entirety of your life, regardless of what happens to every other relationship around you. Everyone else carries their own inner world, their own history, their own private fears to manage. You cannot carry the emotional weight of every person around you and still have anything left over to build a life of your own. At some point, quietly, without needing to explain it to anyone, you have to turn that lamp toward the room you have been standing in all along. So, if you have spent years reading everyone else's mood before checking your own, if you have shrunk your voice to keep the room comfortable, if you have measured your worth by how well you managed other people's expectations, let this be a quiet reminder that it is allowed to stop. Not with anger, not with guilt, but with a calm, steady decision to finally turn your attention back toward the one life you actually have to live, your own. The rooms you have been lighting for everyone else will still be there tomorrow. They will manage. They always have. The one room that has been waiting quietly in the dark cannot borrow its light from anyone else. It has only ever been waiting on you. If this made you pause and think about your own life for a moment, that pause matters. Take a moment to subscribe for more reflections like this one, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I would genuinely like to hear where you are in this journey.